Don't laugh at me because we know drawings. Okay. So, hopefully you guys will be able to see this. Yeah, I did. I should have done it in a darker. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is when we're measuring to each one of them, we would put lines on the top of a paper. So 6-second strip, they on tests, you would have, I have my ECG workbook. Just a regular rhythm here so that you guys can see it. Okay. Move my water so I don't tip it over. Okay. So I've got a rhythm right here. Right? And so what I'm going to do is remember the QRS, at the height of that, all I'm going to do, this is a 6-second strip right here. Okay? So in order to tell me how fast the heart is beating, I'm just going to count every part of it, okay, and every QRS that's on there in that 6-second strip. So if I counted that, I got 9, okay, so there's 9 QRSs in that 6-second strip, which would make my rate 90, okay. So the rate would be 90 because 6 seconds, we're looking at 60 seconds to tell me what my heart rate is, right? So 6 seconds, I would need to times it by 10. So if I have 9 of those, I times it by 10, which gives me my rate of 90. Okay? But when we're measuring to see if it's regular or irregular, you take the height of the R, and what we would do is we would take a piece of paper, and you go up from one to the next, and then you're using that as your template, and then you move it across. So when I'm doing this, see that up here, I'm doing that based off of where these are, where those are, okay? And then I'm going to take that template, and I'm going to move it across the paper and see if it marches out. They should match up each time. That makes it regular. If it doesn't match up, it's irregular, okay? And sometimes there's so many beats, you have to measure it because it looks like it's regular when you just glance at it, but then you measure it and there's a slight difference, which makes it irregular, okay? And so the measurement has to be accurate, okay? And that's why that's the easiest way to do it, is getting down to basics. We don't need technology. We need, okay, enough, right? All right, let's break down these parts, okay? All right, so let's start off with, a P wave, right? This P wave right here, this little hump right here when we start out. That little P is representing the atrial contraction. So when the atria at the top contract, that's the P wave. Boom, okay? Atria is contracting, all right? So that little hump right there represents the atria contracting. End of story, okay? The PR interval, so from the start of the atria contracting until I have the ventricle contract, that is my PR interval. That is the amount of time, the conduction time between my atria contracting and my ventricle contracting, okay? So it's measured from the time that atria starts to contract until the start of the ventricle contraction. Just like measuring contractions on a female when she's in labor, right? The start of one contraction until the start of the next contraction, okay? How far apart are they? The PR interval is kind of the same idea. The start of the atria contracting until the start of the ventricle contracting. That's our PR interval, okay? Why is that important? Who cares? Well, it's also representing the SA node firing until the AV node releases the signal and sends it, okay? Right. So you have the SA node firing, creating the P wave, and then we're waiting for that AV node. AV node's holding on, and now it's releasing, allowing for the ventricle to contract. Okay, so that's what it's representing. That's what we're looking at when we look at that PR interval. Hey, the SA node fired. Now the AV node released it. That's the PR interval. That's what that is representing. Okay, so it's important to understand because there is a time frame that is important to make it a regular, regular contraction happening, and to have it be a regular rhythm. So your PR interval should not be less than 0.12, which is 3 little boxes. Remember, they're 0.04. So if I have a 0.12, that's 3 boxes, 3 little boxes. It shouldn't be any shorter than that, and it shouldn't be any longer than 1 big box, which is 5 little boxes. Okay, so your range for your PR interval should be 0.12 to 0.20. Okay, that's the range. That's a good time frame for it to be in a normal rhythm. Okay, for it not to be going too slow, not to be going too fast. Normal rhythm. So between 60 and 100. Okay, it's got to be somewhere between 0.12 and 0.20. Okay, all right. Moving on to the next part. Your QRS complex. So our QRS complex represents the ventricle contracting. Okay, so as the AV node releases, it sends a signal through the bundle it has, through the AV bundle, right? Comes down, branches off into the bundle branches, comes down and around, okay? So you're getting the height of that, basically that contraction. It's beginning, and then when it reaches full force, you got the R and coming back down off of it. And then it's supposed to go back to baseline. So your QRS complex is going to be here when we start to see everything's about baseline, okay, in the ECG. So we got baseline right here. We start to see it dip down. That's the start of the Q. Q, R, S. When it comes up to baseline, that's when the contraction is done. Now we're hitting the point of it in repolarization, okay, and moving on. So this is ventricular depolarization, or the contraction of that ventricle. It begins when we start to dip below baseline, dip below, up, and come back down, and come back to baseline, okay? This, the number we're looking for, is less than 0.12 seconds, okay? 3 little boxes. That should all happen within 3 little boxes or less. That's a narrow QRS complex. That's what we call it, a narrow QRS complex. Because we want it to be narrow. That means that the contraction is happening like it should. SA node, AV node, coming down and around. You got the atria contracting, ventricle contracting, atria contracting, ventricle contracting, okay? And that's what we're looking for on that. So your QRS, at the start of when it comes down from the baseline, goes up, down, comes back to baseline. Now, why do I keep talking about that baseline? Well, the baseline is really important because when things don't hit baseline again, there's an issue, okay? So that baseline is really important for us to have. So we have to make sure we don't have a lot of artifact because it makes it really hard to look at baseline, okay? So when we talk about baseline set of vitals, what does that mean when we talk about baseline set of vitals? When I'm getting my vital signs, my first set of vital signs becomes my baseline. I am looking at every other reassessment that I do, I'm basing it off that first set of vitals. What has changed since that first set of vitals? That's my baseline, okay? Now, is that the patient's normal baseline? We don't know. But what's happening right now, that's baseline, and that's what we represent. That's what we base everything else off of. When we're looking at this, when we look at an ECG, that line, this line right here, represents my baseline. Oops. Okay? And my baseline, everything needs to come back to that baseline. Okay? In order for everything to be functioning normally. Okay? We look at that. All right? Am I already making people want to hurt themselves? Okay. All right. Next, we're going to talk about, briefly, I'm going to tell you about the QR interval. So your QR interval indicates all your ventricular activity. From the time the ventricle contracts till the time it ramps back up to get ready to contract again. Okay, so the depolarization and the repolarization is your QT interval. So we start at the Q, okay, so at the beginning of the contraction, all the way through the T wave, which represents the full repolarization of the ventricle. So we're looking at from when it depolarizes all the way through till it repolarizes. Okay, it's that's what your QT interval is. Okay, it's both parts of it. People have issues with their QT interval. We're not getting into that. Okay, that is a different class. We're not getting into that detail right now. And we're not going to talk about different conditions and disease processes and all that kind of stuff. Okay, stents. Depolarization through the repolarization of the ventricle. Okay, now the T wave is the repolarization. Why don't we see on the P wave? Why don't we see something representing the repolarization of the atria? Does anyone know? We can't see it because it's hidden in when the ventricle contracts. There's some more force in the ventricle contracting than when that atria is repolarizing. We're seeing the ventricle contracting, so it's hidden within the QRS. So we don't see the repolarization on an ECG because it's hidden in that QRS. Okay, QRS is dominating and it's taking over on electricity, so we don't see that repolarization. Okay. All right. ST segment or ST interval. It's a segment. Okay. So what we're talking about with the ST is basically the early part of repolarization. Okay. It starts when the ST gets back up to baseline and gets to the T. Well, sometimes that doesn't go back to baseline. Sometimes it's elevated. Sometimes it's depressed. Okay. So ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction is a STEMI. Right. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about this area here. If my QRS comes down and then comes back up, and then T wave comes up, it doesn't come back to baseline, that's ST segment elevation. If my S comes all the way back down here, but it trickles over and then my T wave happens and it doesn't come back up to baseline, that's ST segment depression. Okay? Both of those aren't good. Okay? It means that there's something going on in the heart that's not allowing us to get back to baseline. What is it? A lot of times it's an occlusion. Okay? That's not allowing us to get back to baseline. So we look to see where in the heart that's happening. Okay? That's why we do 12 leads. Okay? So ST segment doesn't mean that they, when we have somebody who's having chest pain and we do a 12 lead, they're not always going to have, oh, look, ST segment elevation. Oh, look, ST segment elevation. They don't always have ST segment elevation because it can be happening for other reasons. They can be having chest pain for other reasons besides an occlusion in an artery. Okay? There can be other things that are creating the issue. Or it can be a different area. Okay? Alright. So the electrical and mechanical events, so when the P wave is representing this atrial contraction, so the activation of the atria, the QRS is the activation of the ventricles, okay? Then you have the recovery wave, which is your T wave. So basically getting everything prepped, ready to go again, and go. Prep, ready to go, and go, right? When you do, if you ran track in high school or college or whatever, and you're running, and then they have you do the interval training, right? Where you run 100 yards, and then you walk 100 yards, and then you run, you sprint. You're sprinting 100 yards and walking 100 yards. You're doing your intervals. This is kind of the same thing. It's getting your muscles prepped up, ready to go to sprint again, right? And you're doing that training, building up your ability for your muscles to do that. Well, your heart does that with the recovery phase. It's getting ready to build back up. It gives it a rest time. Okay, you just worked really hard. Now work hard again. Go. Okay, now rest again. Okay, go. What it's doing is it's allowing it that time to rest so it doesn't get tired and go, oh, I can't do this anymore, right? Because if we didn't give our heart time to rest, our heart is one of the areas that constantly works, right? From the time we're born, or before we're born, in vitro, all the way through till we die, our heart is working, okay? It's a hard worker, right? So it deserves to get its blood flow before everybody else. It deserves to get its oxygen before everybody else, but it also deserves to have recovery time. Otherwise, it's going to wear out a lot quicker, okay? And so that's what's important, to have that recovery time, all right? So thinking about that, when you have your heart rate increase, how long is your recovery time? It's shortened. So how long can we be doing that for? Now, there's good interval recovery time, and then there is really bad interval recovery time. Okay? All right, placing those leads. So let's place the leads, and then we'll take a break. So